Preface for The Life and Adventures of Venture. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life and Adventures of Venture, by Venture Smith. Preface. The following account of the life of Venture is a relation of simple facts, in which nothing is in substance to what he relates himself. Many other interesting and curious passages of his life might have been inserted, but on account of the bulk to which they must necessarily have swelled this narrative, they were omitted. If any should suspect the truth of what is here related, they are referred to people now living who are acquainted with most of the facts mentioned in this narrative. The reader is here presented with an account, not of a renowned politician or warrior, but of an untutored African slave, brought into this Christian country at 8 years of age, wholly destitute of all education but what he received in common with other domesticated animals, enjoying no advantages that could lead him to suppose himself superior to the beasts, his fellow servants. And if he shall enjoy no other advantage from perusing this narrative, he may experience those sensations of shame and indignation that will prove him to be not wholly destitute of every noble and generous feeling. The subject of the following pages, had he received only a common education, might have been a man of high respectability and usefulness, and had his education been suited to his genius, he might have been an ornament and an honor to human nature. It may perhaps not be unpleasing to see the efforts of a great mind wholly uncultivated, enfeebled and depressed by slavery, and struggling under every disadvantage. The reader may here see a Franklin and a Washington in a state of nature, or rather in a state of slavery. Destitute as he is of all education, he still exhibits striking traces of native ingenuity and good sense. This narrative exhibits a pattern of honesty, prudence, and industry to people of his own color, and perhaps some white people would not find themselves degraded by imitating such an example. The following account is published in compliance with the earnest desire of the subject of it, and likewise a number of respectable persons who are acquainted with him. End of preface. Recording by Bill Borst. Chapter 1 of The Life and Adventures of Venture. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Life and Adventures of Venture, by Venture Smith. Chapter 1. Containing an account of his life, from his birth to the time of his leaving his native country. I was born at Dukandarra, in Guinea, about the year 1729. My father's name was Songm Furro, prince of the tribe of Dukandarra. My father had 3 wives. Polygamy was not uncommon in that country, especially among the rich, as every man was allowed to keep as many wives as he could maintain. By his first wife he had 3 children. The eldest of them was myself, named by my father Brotir. The other 2 were named Kundazo and Suzaduka. My father had 2 children by his second wife, and 1 by his third. I descended from a very large, tall, and stout race of beings, much larger than the generality of people in other parts of the globe, being commonly considerably above 6 feet in height, and in every way well proportioned. The first thing worthy of notice which I remember was a contention between my father and mother, on account of my father's marrying his third wife without the consent of his first and eldest, which was contrary to the custom generally observed among my countrymen. In consequence of this rupture, my mother left her husband and country, and travelled away with her 3 children to the eastward. I was then 5 years old. She took not the least sustenance along with her, to support either herself or children. I was able to travel along by her side. The other 2 of her offspring she carried, one on her back, and the other, being a sucking child, in her arms. When we became hungry, my mother used to set us down on the ground, and gather some of the fruits which grew spontaneously in that climate. These served us for food on the way. At night we all lay down together in the most secure place we could find, and reposed ourselves until morning. Though there were many noxious animals there, yet so kind was our Almighty Protector, that none of them were ever permitted to hurt or molest us. Thus we went on our journey, until the 2nd day after our departure from Dukandarra, when we came to the entrance of a great desert. During our travel in that, we were often affrighted with the doleful howlings and yellings of wolves, lions, and other animals. After 5 days' travel we came to the end of this desert, and immediately entered into a beautiful and extensive interval country. Here my mother was pleased to stop and seek a refuge for me. She left me at the house of a very rich farmer. I was then, I should judge, not less than 140 miles from my native place, separated from all my relations and acquaintance. At this place my mother took her farewell of me, and set out for her own country. My new guardian, as I shall call the man with whom I was left, put me into the business of tending sheep, immediately after I was left with him. The flock which I kept with the assistance of a boy consisted of about 40. We drove them every morning between 2 and 3 miles to pasture, into the wide and delightful plains. When night drew on, we drove them home and secured them in the cote. In this round I continued during my stay there. One incident that befell me when I was driving my flock from pasture was so dreadful to me at that age, and is to this time fresh in my memory, that I cannot help noticing it in this place. 2 large dogs sallied out of a certain house, and set upon me. One of them took me by the arm, and the other by the thigh, and before their master could come and relieve me, they lacerated my flesh to such a degree that the scars are very visible to the present day. My master was immediately sent for. He came and carried me home, as I was unable to go myself on account of my wounds. Nothing remarkable happened afterwards until my father sent for me to return home. Before I dismiss this country, I must just inform my reader what I remember concerning this place. A large river runs through this country in a westerly course. The land for a great way on each side is flat and level, hedged in by a considerable rise of the country at a great distance from it. It scarce ever rains there, yet the land is fertile. Great dews fall in the night, which refresh the soil. About the latter end of June or 1st of July the river begins to rise, and gradually increases until it has inundated the country for a great distance, to a height of 7 or 8 feet. This brings on a slime which enriches the land surprisingly. When the river has subsided, the natives begin to sow and plant, and the vegetation is exceedingly rapid. Near this rich river my guardian's land lay. He possessed, I cannot tell exactly how much, yet this I am certain of respecting it, that he owned an immense tract. He possessed likewise a great many cattle and goats. During my stay with him I was kindly used, and with as much tenderness for what I saw as his only son, although I was an entire stranger to him, remote from friends and relations. The principal occupation of the inhabitants there were the cultivation of the soil and the care of their flocks. They were a people pretty similar in every respect to that of mine, except in their persons, which were not so tall and stout. They appeared to be very kind and friendly. I will now return to my departure from that place. My father sent a man and horse after me. After settling with my guardian for keeping me, he took me away and went for home. It was then about 1 year since my mother brought me here. Nothing remarkable occurred to us on our journey until we arrived safe home. I found then that the difference between my parents had been made up previous to their sending for me. On my return, I was received both by my father and mother with great joy and affection, and was once more restored to my paternal dwelling in peace and happiness. I was then about 6 years old. Not more than 6 weeks had passed after my return, before a message was brought by an inhabitant of the place where I lived the preceding year to my father, that that place had been invaded by a numerous army from a nation not far distant, furnished with musical instruments, and all kinds of arms then in use; that they were instigated by some white nation, who equipped and sent them to subdue and possess the country; that his nation had made no preparation for war, having been for a long time in profound peace, that they could not defend themselves against such a formidable train of invaders, and must therefore necessarily evacuate their lands to the fierce enemy, and fly to the protection of some chief; and that if he would permit them, they should come under his rule and protection when they had to retreat from their own possessions. He was a kind and merciful prince, and therefore consented to these proposals. He had scarcely returned to his nation with the message, before the whole of his people were obliged to retreat from their country, and come to my father's dominions. He gave them every privilege and all the protection his government could afford, but they had not been there longer than 4 days before news came to them that the invaders had laid waste their country, and were coming speedily to destroy them in my father's territories. This affrighted them, and therefore they immediately pushed off to the southward, into the unknown countries there, and were never more heard of. 2 days after their retreat, the report turned out to be but too true. A detachment of the enemy came to my father and informed him that the whole army was encamped not far out of his dominions, and would invade the territory and deprive his people of their liberties and rights, if he did not comply with the following terms. These were to pay them a large sum of money, 300 fat cattle, and a great number of goats, sheep, asses, etc. My father told the messenger that he would comply rather than that his subjects should be deprived of their rights and privileges, which he was not then in circumstances to defend from so sudden an invasion. Upon turning out these articles, the enemy pledged their faith and honor that they would not attack him. On these he relied, and therefore thought it unnecessary to be on his guard against the enemy. But their pledges of faith and honor proved no better than those of other unprincipled hostile nations. For a few days after, a certain relation of the king came and informed him that the enemy who sent terms of accommodation to him, and received tribute to their satisfaction, yet meditated an attack on his subjects by surprise, and that probably they would commence their attack in less than 1 day, and concluded with advising him, as he was not prepared for war, to order a speedy retreat of his family and subjects. He complied with this advice. The same night which was fixed upon to retreat, my father and his family set off about break of day. The king and his 2 younger wives went in one company, and my mother and her children in another. We left our dwellings in succession, and my father's company went on first. We directed our course for a large shrub plain, some distance off, where we intended to conceal ourselves from the approaching enemy, until we could refresh and rest ourselves a little. But we presently found that our retreat was not secure, for having struck up a little fire for purposes of cooking victuals, the enemy, who happened to be encamped a little distance off, had sent out a scouting party, which discovered us by the smoke of the fire, just as we were extinguishing it and about to eat. As soon as we had finished eating, my father discovered the party, and immediately began to discharge arrows at them. This was what I first saw, and it alarmed both me and the women, who, being unable to make any resistance, immediately betook ourselves to the tall thick reeds not far off, and left the old king to fight alone. For some time I beheld him from the reeds defending himself with great courage and firmness, till at last he was obliged to surrender himself into their hands. Then they came to us in the reeds, and the very first salute I had from them was a violent blow on the head with the forepart of a gun, and at the same time a grasp around the neck. I then had a rope put about my neck, as had all the women in the thicket with me, and were immediately led to my father, who was likewise pinioned and haltered for leading. In this condition we were all led to the camp. The women and myself, being pretty submissive, had tolerable treatment from the enemy, while my father was closely interrogated respecting his money, which they knew he must have. But as he gave them no account of it, he was instantly cut and pounded on his body with great inhumanity, that he might be induced by the torture he suffered to make the discovery. All this availed not the least to make him give up his money, but he despised all the tortures which they inflicted, until the continued exercise and increase of torment obliged him to sink and expire. He thus died without informing his enemies of the place where his money lay. I saw him while he was thus tortured to death. The shocking scene is to this day fresh in my mind, and I have often been overcome while thinking on it. He was a man of remarkable stature. I should judge as much as 6 feet and 6 or 7 inches high, 2 feet across his shoulders, and every way well proportioned. He was a man of remarkable strength and resolution, affable, kind, and gentle, ruling with equity and moderation. The army of the enemy was large, I should suppose consisting of about 6,000 men. Their leader was called Baukur. After destroying the old prince they decamped and immediately marched towards the sea, lying to the west, taking with them myself and the women prisoners. In the march a scouting party was detached from the main army. To the leader of this party I was made waiter, having to carry his gun, etc. As we were a scouting, we came across a herd of fat cattle, consisting of about 30 in number. These we set upon, and immediately wrested from their keepers, and afterwards converted them into food for the army. The enemy had remarkable success in destroying the country wherever they went, for as far as they had penetrated, they laid the habitations waste and captured the people. The distance they had now brought me was about 400 miles. All the march I had very hard tasks imposed on me, which I must perform on pain of punishment. I was obliged to carry on my head a large flat stone used for grinding our corn, weighing, as I should suppose, as much as 25 pounds, besides victuals, mat and cooking utensils. Though I was pretty large and stout of my age, yet these burthens were very grievous to me, being only about 6 years and a half old. We were then come to a place called Malagafco. When we entered the place, we could not see the least appearance of either houses or inhabitants, but upon stricter search found that instead of houses above ground, they had dens in the sides of hillocks, contiguous to ponds and streams of water. In these we perceived they had all hid themselves, as I suppose they usually did upon such occasions. In order to compel them to surrender, the enemy contrived to smoke them out with faggots. These they put to the entrance of the caves and set them on fire. While they were engaged in this business, to their great surprise some of them were desperately wounded with arrows, which fell from above on them. This mystery they soon found out. They perceived that the enemy discharged these arrows through holes on the top of the dens directly into the air. Their weight brought them back, point downwards, on their enemies' heads, whilst they were smoking the inhabitants out. The points of the arrows were poisoned, but their enemy had an antidote for it, which they instantly applied to the wounded part. The smoke at last obliged the people to give themselves up. They came out of their caves, first spatting the palms of their hands together, then and immediately after extended their arms, crossed at their wrists, ready to be bound and pinioned. I should judge that the dens above mentioned were extended about 8 feet horizontally into the earth, 5 feet in height, and as many wide. They were arched overhead and lined with earth, which was of the clay kind, and made the surface of their walls firm and smooth. The invaders then pinioned the prisoners of all ages and sexes indiscriminately, took their flocks and all their effects, and moved on their way towards the sea. On the march the prisoners were treated with clemency, on account of their being submissive and humble. Having come to the next tribe, the enemy laid siege and immediately took men, women, children, flocks, and all their valuable effects. They then went on to the next district, which was contiguous with the sea, called in Africa Anamabu. The enemy's provisions were then almost spent, as well as their strength. The inhabitants, knowing what kind of conduct they had pursued, and what were their present intentions, improved the favorable opportunity, attacked them, and took enemy, prisoners, flocks, and all their effects. I was then taken a second time. All of us were then put into the castle and kept for market. On a certain time I and other prisoners were put on board a canoe under our master, and rowed away to a vessel belonging to Rhode Island, commanded by Captain Collingwood, and the mate Thomas Mumford. While we were going to the vessel, our master told us all to appear to the best possible advantage for sale. I was bought on board by one Robertson Mumford, steward of said vessel, for 4 gallons of rum and a piece of calico, and called Venture, on account of his having purchased me with his own private venture. Thus I came by my name. All the slaves that were bought for that vessel's cargo were 260. End of chapter 1. Recording by Bill Borst. Chapter 2 of the Life and Adventures of Venture. This recording is in the public domain. The Life and Adventures of Venture, by Venture Smith. Chapter 2. Containing an account of his life, from the time of his leaving Africa to that of his becoming free. After all the business was ended on the coast of Africa, the ship sailed from thence to Barbados. After an ordinary passage, except great mortality from small pox, which broke out on board, we arrived at the island of Barbadoes. But when we reached it, there were found out of the 260 that sailed from Africa, not more than 200 alive. These were all sold, except for myself and 3 more, to the planters there. The vessel then sailed for Rhode Island, and arrived there after a comfortable passage. Here my master sent me to live with one of his sisters, until he could carry me to Fisher's Island, the place of his residence. I had then completed my 8th year. After staying with his sister some time, I was taken to my master's place to live. When we arrived at Narragansett, my master went ashore in order to return a part of the way by land, and gave me the charge of the keys of his trunks on board the vessel, and charged me not to deliver them up to anybody, not even to his father, without his orders. To his directions I promised faithfully to conform. When I arrived with my master's articles at his house, my master's father asked me for his son's keys, as he wanted to see what his trunks contained. I told him that my master entrusted me with the care of them until he should return, and that I had given him my word to be faithful to the trust, and could not therefore give him or any other person the keys without my master's directions. He insisted that I should deliver him the keys, threatening to punish me if I did not. But I let him know that he should not have them say what he would. He then laid aside trying to get them. But notwithstanding he appeared to give up trying to obtain them from me, yet I mistrusted that he would take some time when I was off my guard, either in the daytime or at night, to get them. Therefore I slung them around my neck, and in the day concealed them in my bosom, and at night I always lay with them under me, that no person might take them from me without being apprized of it. Thus I kept the keys from everybody until my master came home. When he returned he asked where Venture was. As I was then within hearing, I came, said, "Here, sir, at your service." He asked me for his keys, and I immediately took them off my neck and reached them out to him. He took them, stroked my hair, and commended me, saying in presence of his father that his young Venture was so faithful that he would never have been able to have taken the keys from him but by violence; that he should not fear to trust him with his whole fortune, for that he had been in his native place so habituated to keeping his word, that he would sacrifice even his life to maintain it. The first of the time of living at my master's own place, I was pretty much employed in the house at carding wool and other household business. In this situation I continued for some years, after which my master put me to work out of doors. After many proofs of my faithfulness and honesty, my master began to put great confidence in me. My behaviour to him had as yet been submissive and obedient. I then began to have hard tasks imposed on me. Some of these were to pound 4 bushels of ears of corn every night in a barrel for the poultry, or to be rigorously punished. At other seasons of the year I had to card wool until a very late hour. These tasks I had to perform when I was about 9 years old. Some time after I had another difficulty and oppression which was greater than any I had ever experienced since I came into this country. This was to serve 2 masters. James Mumford, my master's son, when his father had gone from home in the morning, and given me a stint to perform that day, would order me to do this and that business, different from what my master directed me. One day in particular, the authority which my master's son had set up, had like to have produced melancholy effects. For my master having set me off my business to perform that day, and then left me to perform it, his son came up to me in the course of the day, big with authority, and commanded me very arrogantly to quit my present business and go directly about what he should order me. I replied to him that my master had given me so much to perform that day, and that I must therefore faithfully complete it in that time. He then broke out in a great rage, snatched a pitchfork, and went to lay me over the head therewith. But I as soon got another and defended myself with it, or otherwise he might have murdered me in his outrage. He immediately called some people, who were hearing, at work for him, and ordered them to take his hair rope and come and bind me with it. They all tried to bind me, but in vain, though there were 3 assistants in number. My upstart master then desisted, put his pocket handkerchief before his eyes, and went home with a design to tell his mother of the struggle with young VENTURE. He told her that their young VENTURE had become so stubborn that he could not control him, and asked her what he should do with him. In the meantime I recovered my temper, voluntarily caused myself to be bound by the same men who tried in vain before, and carried before my young master that he might do what he pleased with me. He took me to a gallows made for the purpose of hanging cattle on, and suspended me on it. Afterwards he ordered one of his hands to go to the peach orchard, and cut him 3 dozens of whips to punish me with. These were brought to him, and that was all that was done with them, as I was released, and went to work after hanging on the gallows about an hour. After I lived with my master 13 years, being then about 22 years old, I married Meg, a slave of his, who was about my age. My master owned a certain Irishman, named Heddy, who about that time formed a plan of secretly leaving his master. After he had long had this plan in meditation, he suggested it to me. At first I cast a deaf ear on it, and rebuked Heddy for harboring in his mind such a rash undertaking. But after he had persuaded and much enchanted me with the prospect of gaining my freedom with such a method, I at length agreed to accompany him. Heddy next inveigled 2 of his fellow servants to accompany us. The place to which we designed to go was the Mississippi. Our next business was to lay in a sufficient store of provisions for our voyage. We privately collected out of our master's store 6 great old cheeses, 2 firkins of butter, and 1 whole batch of new bread. When we had gathered all our own clothes and some more, we took them all about midnight, and went to the water side. We stole our master's boat, embarked, then directed our course for the Mississippi River. We mutually confederated not to betray or desert one another on pain of death. We first steered our course for Montauk Point, the east end of Long Island. After our arrival there we landed, and Heddy and I made an incursion into the island after fresh water, while our 2 comrades were left at a little distance from the boat, employed at cooking. When Heddy and I had sought some time for water, he returned to our companions, and I continued on looking for my object. When Heddy had performed his business with our companions, who were engaged in cooking, he went directly to the boat, stole all the clothes in it, and then travelled away for East Hampton, as I was informed. I returned to my fellows not long after. They informed me that our clothes were stolen, but could not determine who was the thief, yet they suspected Heddy as he was missing. After reproving my 2 comrades for not taking care of our things which were in the boat, I advertised Heddy and sent 2 men in search of him. They pursued and overtook him at Southampton, and returned him to the boat. I then thought it might afford some chance for my freedom, or at least a palliation for my running away, to return Heddy immediately to his master, and inform him that I was induced to go away by Heddy's address. Accordingly, I set off with him and the rest of my companions for our master's, and arrived there without any difficulty. I informed my master that Heddy was the ringleader of our revolt, and that he had used us ill. He immediately put Heddy into custody, and myself and companions were well received, and went to work as usual. Not a long time passed after that before Heddy was sent by my master to New London jail. At the close of that year I was sold to a Thomas Stanton, and had to be separated from my wife and 1 daughter, who was about 1 month old. He resided at Stonington Point. To this place I brought with me from my last master's 2 johanns, 3 old Spanish dollars, and 2,000 of coppers, besides 5 pounds of my wife's money. This money I got by cleaning gentlemen's shoes and drawing boots, by catching muskrats and minks, raising potatoes and carrots, etc., and by fishing in the night and at odd spells. All this money, amounting to near 21 pounds York currency, my master's brother, Robert Stanton, hired of me, for which he gave me his note. About 1 year and a half after that time, my master purchased my wife and her child for 700 pounds old tenor. One time my master sent me 2 miles after a barrel of molasses, and ordered me to carry it on my shoulders. I made out to carry it all the way to my master's house. When I lived with Captain George Mumford, only to try my strength, I took up on my knees a tierce of salt containing 7 bushels, and carried it 2 or 3 rods. Of this fact there are several eye witnesses now living. Towards the close of the time that I resided with this master, I had a falling out with my mistress. This happened one time when my master was gone to Long Island a gunning. At first the quarrel began between my wife and her mistress. I was then at work in the barn, and hearing a racket in the house, induced me to run there and see what had broken out. When I entered the house, I found my mistress in a violent passion with my wife, for what she informed me was a mere trifle. Such a small affair that I forbare to put my mistress to the shame of having it known. I earnestly requested my wife to beg pardon of her mistress, for the sake of peace, even if she had given no just occasion for offence. But whilst I was thus saying, my mistress turned the blows which she was repeating on my wife to me. She took down her horsewhip, and while she was glutting her fury with it, I reached out my great black hand, raised it up, and received the blows of the whip on it, which were designed for my head. Then I immediately committed the whip to the devouring fire. When my master returned from the island, his wife told him of the affair, but for the present he seemed to take no notice of it, and mentioned not a word of it to me. Some days after his return, in the morning as I was putting on a log in the fireplace, not suspecting harm from any one, I received a most violent stroke on the crown of my head with a club 2 feet long and as large around as a chair post. This blow very badly wounded my head, and the scar of it remains to this day. The first blow made me have my wits about me, as you may suppose, for as soon as he went to renew it, I snatched the club out of his hands and dragged him out of the door. He then sent for his brother to come and assist him, but I presently left my master, took the club he wounded me with, carried it to a neighboring justice of the peace, and complained of my master. He finally advised me to return to my master and live contented with him until he abused me again, and then complain. I consented to do accordingly. But before I set out for my master's, up he come and his brother Robert after me. The justice improved this convenient opportunity to caution my master. He asked him for what he treated his slave thus hastily and unjustly, and told him what would be the consequence if he continued the same treatment towards me. After the justice had ended his discourse with my master, he and his brother set out with me for home, one before and the other behind me. When they had come to a by place, they both dismounted their respective horses, and fell to beating me with great violence. I became enraged at this, and immediately turned them both under me, laid one of them across the other, and stamped both with my feet what I would. This occasioned my master's brother to advise him to put me off. A short time after this I was taken by a constable and 2 men. They carried me to a blacksmith's shop, and had me handcuffed. When I returned home, my mistress inquired much of her waiters, whether VENTURE was handcuffed. When she was informed that I was, she appeared to be very contented, and was much transported with the news. In the midst of all this content and joy, I presented myself before my mistress, shewed her my handcuffs, and gave her thanks for my gold rings. For this my master commanded a negro of his to fetch him a large ox chain. This my master locked on my legs with 2 padlocks. I continued to wear the chain peaceably for 2 or 3 days, when my master asked me with contemptuous hard names, whether I had not better be freed from my chains and go to work. I answered him no. Well then, said he, I will send you to the West Indies, or banish you, for I am resolved not to keep you. I answered him, I crossed the waters to come here, and I am willing to cross them to return. For a day or 2 after this not any one said much to me, until one Hempstead miner, of Stonington, asked me if I would live with him. I answered him that I would. He then requested me to make myself discontented, and to appear as unreconciled to my master as I could before that he bargained with him for me, and that in return he would give me a good chance to gain my freedom when I came to live with him. I did as he requested me. Not long after Hempstead miner purchased me of my master for 56 pounds lawful. He took the chain and padlocks off me immediately after. It may here be remembered that I related a few pages back that I hired out a sum of money to Mr. Robert Stanton, and took his note for it. In the fray between my master Stanton and myself, he broke open my chest containing his brother's note to me, and destroyed it. Immediately after my present master bought me, he determined to sell me at Hartford. As soon as I became apprised of it, I bethought myself that I would secure a certain sum of money which lay by me, safer than to hire it out to Stanton. Accordingly, I buried it in the earth, a little distance from Thomas Stanton's, in the road over which he passed daily. A short time after, my master carried me to Hartford, and first proposed to sell me to one William Hooker of that place. Hooker asked whether I would go to the German Flats with him. I answered, no. He said I should, if not by fair means, I should by foul. If you will go by no other measures, I will tie you down in my sleigh. I replied to him, that if he carried me in that manner, no person would purchase me, for it would be thought that he had a murderer for sale. After this he tried no more, and said he would not have me as a gift. My master next offered me to Daniel Edwards, Esq., of Hartford, for sale, but not purchasing me, my master pawned me to him for £10, and returned to Stonington. After some trial of my honesty, Mr. Edwards placed considerable trust and confidence in me. He put me to serve as his cup-bearer and waiter. When there was company at his house, he would send me into his cellar and other parts of his house to fetch wine and other articles occasionally for them. When I had been with him for some time, he asked me why my master wished to part with such an honest negro, and why he did not keep me himself. I replied that I could not give him the reason, unless it was to convert me into cash, and speculate with me as with other commodities. I hope he can never justly say it was on account of my ill conduct that he did not keep me himself. Mr. Edwards told me that he should be very willing to keep me himself, and that he would never let me go from him to live, if it was not unreasonable and inconvenient for me to be parted from my wife and children. Therefore he would furnish me with a horse to return to Stonington, if I had a mind for it. As Miner did not appear to redeem me, I went, and called at my old master Stanton's first to see my wife, who was then owned by him. As my old master appeared much ruffled at my being there, I left my wife before I had spent considerable time with her, and went to Colonel O. Smith's. Miner had not as yet wholly settled with Stanton for me, and had before my return from Hartford given Colonel Smith a bill of sale for me. These men once met to determine which of them should hold me, and upon my expressing a desire to be owned by Colonel Smith, and upon my master's settling the remainder of the money which was due Stanton for me, it was agreed that I should live with Colonel Smith. This was the third time of my being sold, and I was then 31 years old. As I never had an opportunity of redeeming myself whilst I was owned by Miner, though he promised to give me a chance, I was then very ambitious of obtaining it. I asked my master one time if he would consent to have me purchase my freedom. He replied that he would. I was then very happy, knowing that I was at that time able to pay part of the purchase money, by means of the money which I some time since buried. This I took out of the earth and tendered to my master, having previously engaged a free negro man to take his security for it, as I was the property of my master, and therefore could not safely take his obligation myself. What was wanted in redeeming myself my master agreed to wait on me for, until I could procure it for him. I still continued to work for Colonel Smith. There was continually some interest accruing on my master's note to my friend, the free negro man above named, which I received, and with some besides which I got by fishing, I laid out in land adjoining to my old master Stanton's. By cultivating this land with the greatest diligence and economy, at times when my master did not require my labor, in 2 years I laid up £10. This my friend tendered to my master for myself, and received his note for it. Being encouraged by the success which I had met in redeeming myself, I again solicited my master for a further chance of completing it. The chance for which I solicited him was that of going out to work the ensuing winter. He agreed to this on condition that I would give him 1/4 of my earnings. On these terms I worked the following winter and earned £4 16s, 1/4 of which went to my master for the privilege, and the rest was paid him on my own account. This added to the other payments made up £44 8s, which I had paid on my own account. I was then about 35 years old. The next summer I again desired he would give me a chance of going out to work, but he refused, and answered that he must have my labor this summer, as he did not have it the past winter. I replied that I considered it as hard that I could not have a chance to work out when the season became advantageous, and that I must only be permitted to hire myself out in the poorest season of the year. He asked me after this what I would give for the privilege per month. I replied that I would leave it wholly with his own generosity to determine what I should return him a month. "Well, then," said he, "if so, £2 a month." I answered him that if that was the least he would take, I would be contented. Accordingly I hired myself out at Fisher's Island, and earned £20, £13 6s of which my master drew for the privilege, and the remainder I paid him for my freedom. This made £51 2s, which I paid him. In October following I went and wrought 6 months at Long Island. In that 6 months' time I cut and corded 400 cords of wood, besides threshing out 75 bushels of grain, and received of my wages down only £20, which left remaining a larger sum. Whilst I was out that time, I took upon my wages only 1 pair of shoes. At night I lay upon the hearth, with one coverlet over and another under me. I returned to my master, and gave him what I received on my 6 months' labor. This left only £13 18s to make up the full sum for my redemption. My master liberated me, saying I might pay what was behind if I could ever make it convenient, otherwise it would be well. The amount of the money which I had paid my master towards redeeming my time was £71 2s. The reason of my master for asking such an unreasonable price was, he said, to secure himself in case I should ever come to want. Being 36 years old, I left Colonel Smith once for all. I had already been sold 3 different times, made considerable money with seemingly nothing to derive it from, been cheated out of a large sum of money, lost much by misfortunes, and paid an enormous sum for my freedom. End of Chapter 2. Recording by Bill Borst. Chapter 3 of the Life and Adventures of Venture. This recording is in the public domain. The Life and Adventures of Venture, by Venture Smith. Chapter 3. Containing an account of his life, from the time of his purchasing his freedom to the present day. My wife and children were yet in bondage to Mr. Thomas Stanton. About this time I lost a chest, containing, besides clothing, about £38 in paper money. It was burnt by accident. A short time after, I sold all my possessions at Stonington, consisting of a pretty piece of land and 1 dwelling house thereon, and went to reside at Long Island. For the first 4 years of my residence there, I spent my time in working for various people on that and at the neighboring islands. In the space of 6 months I cut and corded upwards of 400 cords of wood. Many other singular and wonderful labors I performed in cutting wood there, which would not be inferior to those just recited, but for brevity's sake I must omit them. In the aforementioned 4 years, what wood I cut at Long Island amounted to several thousand cords, and the money which I earned thereby amounted to £207 10s. This money I laid up carefully by me. Perhaps some may inquire, what maintained me all the time I was laying up money? I would inform them that I bought nothing which I did not absolutely want. All fine clothes I despised in comparison with my interest, and never kept but just what clothes were comfortable for common days, and perhaps I would have a garment or two which I did not have on at all times. But as for superfluous finery, I never thought it to be compared with a decent homespun dress, a good supply of money and prudence. Expensive gatherings of my mates I commonly shunned, and all kinds of luxuries I was perfectly a stranger to. And during the time I was employed in cutting the aforementioned quantity of wood, I never was at the expense of sixpence worth of spirits. Being after this labor 40 years of age, I worked at various places, and in particular on Ram Island, which I purchased Solomon and Cuff, 2 sons of mine, for $200 each. It will here be remembered how much money I earned by cutting wood in 4 years. Besides this I had considerable money, amounting in all to near £300. After this I purchased a negro man, for no other reason than to oblige him, and gave him £60. But in a short time after he run away from me, and I thereby lost all that I gave for him, except £20 which he paid me previous to his absconding. The rest of my money I laid out in land, in addition to a farm which I owned before, and a dwelling house thereon. 44 years had then completed their revolution since my entrance into this existence of servitude and misfortune. Solomon, my eldest son, being then in his 17th year, and all my hope and dependence for help, I hired him out to one Charles Church of Rhode Island, for 1 year, on consideration of his giving him £12 and an opportunity of acquiring some learning. In the course of the year, Church fitted out a vessel for a whaling voyage, and being in want of hands to man her, he induced my son to go, with the promise of giving him, on his return, a pair of silver buckles besides his wages. As soon as I heard of his going to sea, I immediately set out to go and prevent it if possible. But on my arrival at Church's, to my great grief, I could only see the vessel my son was on, almost out of sight, going to sea. My son died of the scurvy on this voyage, and Church has never yet paid me the least of his wages. In my son, besides the loss of his life, I lost equal to £75. My other son, being but a youth, still lived with me. About this time I chartered a sloop of about 30 tons burthen, and hired men to assist me in navigating her. I employed her mostly in the wood trade to Rhode Island, and made clear of all expenses above $100 with her in better than 1 year. I had then become something forehanded, and being in my 44th year I purchased my wife Meg, and thereby prevented having another child to buy, as she was then pregnant. I gave £40 for her. During my residence at Long Island I raised 1 year with another 10 cartloads of watermelons, and lost a great many every year besides by the thievishness of the sailors. What I made by the watermelons I sold there amounted to nearly $500. Various other methods in order to enable me to redeem my family. In the night time I fished with set nets and pots for eels and lobsters, and shortly after went a whaling voyage in the service of Colonel Smith. After being 7 months, the vessel returned, laden with 400 barrels of oil. About this time I became possessed of another dwelling house, and my temporal affairs were in a pretty prosperous condition. This and my industry was what alone saved me from being expelled that part of the island in which I resided, as an act was passed by the select men of the place that all negroes residing there should be expelled. Next after my wife I purchased a negro man for $400, but he having an inclination to return to his old master, I therefore let him go. Shortly after I purchased another negro man for £25, who I parted with shortly after. Being about 46 years old, I bought my oldest child Hannah, of Ray Mumford, for £44, and she still resided with him. I had already redeemed from slavery myself, my wife, and 3 children, besides 3 negro men. About the 47th year of my life I disposed all my property at Long Island, and came from thence into East Haddam. I hired myself out at first to Timothy Chapman for 5 weeks, the earnings of which time I put carefully by me. After this I wrought for Abel Bingham about 6 weeks. I then put my money together and purchased of said Bingham 10 acres of land, lying at Haddam Neck, where I now reside. On this land I labored with great diligence for 2 years, and shortly after purchased 6 acres more of land contiguous to my other. 1 year from that time I purchased 70 acres more of the same man, and paid for it mostly with the produce of my other land. Soon after I bought this lot of land, I set up a comfortable dwelling house on my farm, and built it from the produce thereof. Shortly after I had much trouble and expense with my daughter Hannah, whose name has before been mentioned in this account. She was married soon after I redeemed her, to one Isaac, a free negro, and shortly after her marriage fell sick of a mortal disease. Her husband, a dissolute and abandoned wretch, paid but little attention to her in her illness. I therefore thought it best to bring her to my house and nurse her there. I procured her all the aid mortals could afford, but notwithstanding this she fell a prey to her disease after a lingering and painful endurance of it. The physician's bills for attending her during her illness amounted to £40. Having reached my 54th year, I hired 2 negro men, one named William Jacklin, and the other Mingo. Mingo lived with me 1 year, and having received his wages, run in debt to me $8, for which he gave me his note. I procured a warrant, took him, and requested him to go to Justice Throop's of his own accord, but he refusing, I took him on my shoulders, and carried him there, distant about 2 miles. The Justice asking me if I had my prisoner's note with me, and replying that I had not, he told me that I must return with him and get it. Accordingly I carried Mingo back on my shoulders, but before we arrived at my dwelling he complained of being hurt, and asked me if this was not a hard way of treating our fellow creatures. I answered him that it would be hard thus to treat our honest fellow creatures. He then told me that if I would let him off my shoulders, he had a pair of silver shoe buckles, 1 shirt, and a pocket handkerchief, which he would turn out to me. I agreed, and let him return home with me on foot. But the very following night he slipped from me, stole my horse, and has never paid me even his note. The other negro man, Jacklin, being a comb maker by trade, he requested me to set him up, and promised to reward me well with his labor. Accordingly I bought him a set of tools for making combs, and procured him stock. He worked at my house about 1 year, and then run away from me with all his combs, and owed me for all his board. Since my residence at Haddam Neck, I have owned of boats, canoes, and sail vessels not less than 20. These I mostly employed in the fishing and trafficking business, and in these occupations I have been cheated out of considerable money by people whom I traded with taking advantage of my ignorance of numbers. About 12 years ago I hired a whale boat and 4 black men, and proceeded to Long Island after a load of round clams. Having arrived there, I first purchased of James Webb, son of Orange Webb, 660 clams, and afterwards, with the help of my men, finished loading my boat. The same evening, however, this Webb stole my boat, and went in her to Connecticut River and sold her cargo for his own benefit. I thereupon pursued him, and at length, after an additional expense of 9 crowns, recovered the boat. But for the proceeds of her cargo I never could obtain any compensation. 4 years after I met with another loss, far superior to this in value, and I think by no less wicked means. Being going to New London with a grandchild, I took passage on an Indian's boat, and went there with him. On our return, the Indian took on board 2 hogsheads of molasses, one of which belonged to Captain Elijah Hart, of Saybrook, to be delivered to his wharf. When we arrived there, and while I was gone, at the request of the Indian to inform Captain Hart of his arrival, and receive the freight for him, 1 hogshead of the molasses had been lost overboard by the people in attempting to land it on the wharf. Although I was absent at the time, and had no concern whatever in the business, and was known to a number of respectable witnesses, I was nevertheless persecuted by this conscientious gentleman, the Indian not being able to pay for it, and obliged to pay upwards of £10 lawful money, with all the costs of court. I applied to several gentlemen for counsel in this affair, and they advised me, as my adversary was rich, and threatened to carry the matter from court to court till it would cost me more than the first damages would be, to pay the sum and submit to the injury, which I accordingly did, and he has often since insultingly taunted me with my unmerited misfortune. Such a proceeding as this, committed on a defenseless stranger, almost worn out in the hard service of the world, without any foundation in reason or justice, whatever it may be called in a Christian land, would in my native country be branded a crime equal to highway robbery. But Captain Hart was a white gentleman, and I a poor African, and therefore it was all right, and good enough for the black dog. I am now 69 years old. Though once straight and tall, measuring without shoes 6 feet 1 inch and a half, and every way well proportioned, I am now bowed down with age and hardship. My strength, which was once equal, if not superior, to any man whom I have ever seen, is now enfeebled so that life is a burden, and it is with fatigue that I can walk a couple of miles, stooping over my staff. Other griefs are still behind, on account of which some aged people at least will pity me. My eyesight has gradually failed, till I am almost blind, and whenever I go abroad one of my grandchildren must direct my way. Besides, for many years I have been much pained and troubled with an ulcer on one of my legs. But amidst all my griefs and pains I have many consolations. Meg, the wife of my youth, whom I married for love and bought with my money, is still alive. My freedom is a privilege which nothing else can equal. Notwithstanding all the losses I have suffered by fire, by the injustice of knaves, by the cruelty and oppression of false-hearted friends, and the perfidy of my own countrymen, whom I have assisted and redeemed from bondage, I am now possessed of more than 200 acres of land, and 3 habitable dwelling-houses. It gives me joy to think that I have, and that I deserve, so good a character, especially for truth and integrity. While I am now looking to the grave as my home, my joy for this world would be full, if my children, Cuff, for whom I paid $200 when a boy, and Solomon, who was born soon after I purchased his mother, if Cuff and Solomon, oh, that they had walked the way of their father. But a father's lips are closed in silence and grief. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. End of Chapter 3, and end of The Life and Adventures of Venture. Recording by Bill Borst.